Okay, thank you. This is my first time, so if I get your name wrong, please correct me. And if you prefer to go by a different name, please correct me as well. I have Christopher Berg.
He's not present.
Jay Ellington.
Here.
Jamie Green. Brianna Heath.
Here.
Whitney Catchmark. And then you said Nicole Keller. Jack Kolakowski is online.
Yes, sir.
And actually, Nicole Keller is online. Just making sure the other people, I didn't miss names that snuck in. Bear with me. Ben McFarland. Randy Owen. Rachel Peabody, you're online.
I'm here.
I did.
That
was
all
all
I was gonna talk to you about.
Okay.
And
Yeah. I'm not again. I need to be great.
It's not, I mean, you do what you want with it.
we'll mute them. Jessica Steelman. Sarah Stewart.
Present.
Mary Carson Stiff.
Here.
Good morning. Chris Swanson, you're here. Marcus Thornton, you're here. Kathy Vick. And we have Andrew Smith. We did. Where'd he go? Scott Whitehurst, you're online.
Yes, I'm on taking Kathy's place this afternoon. Thank you.
Good morning. Eli, and I'm sorry, I'm not going to try your last name. So tell me how to say it, please. Eli, you're online. You're in for Nicole Keller, I believe.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, thank you. Stu Geiger with Dewberry and Joanna with Dewberry. And we just had.
Right now. It's better. All right.
Do we have enough people for quorum?
Yes, our quorum is who shows up to the meeting, so we are good on that front. Okay. Right, so you all will have in front of you an agenda for the meeting today. We'll do maybe a round of introductions. I think that would be helpful. This is the first time this subcommittee is meeting since it's been reformed since phase 1. So we'll go around and do introductions and then jump into new business. This will take the bulk of the meeting today to discuss the subcommittee role and objectives, subcommittee advisors. We'll talk about the impact assessment outputs and then open it up for a subcommittee discussion and feedback. We'll end with action items and scheduling, and then as always have 20 minutes of reserved public comments before we adjourn. Okay, so introductions, we can go around the table.
Start with me. I'm Ken Lyle, Chief Data Officer for Commonwealth. Marcus Thornton, I'm the Deputy Chief Data Officer for Commonwealth.
Jay Ellington, Crater Planning District Executive Director.
I'm Sarah Stewart, with NRBA, the Resilience Versus Management and Environment Planning.
Morning. Ben McFarland, Chief Resilience Officer, and the Planning District Commission.
Whitney Catchmark, also with HRPDC, Water Resources Department. Mary Carson Stiff with Wetlands Watch. We're a nonprofit based in Norfolk, and the executive director.
Chris Swanson, VDOT's Environmental Division.
Brianna Heath, I am the environmental planner with the Northern Net Peaks.
And I'm Carolyn Heaps-Picaro. I am the Resilience Planning Program Coordinator with DCR, going to be the staff assigned to support this subcommittee. Okay. So I think we can jump into the draft subcommittee role and objectives. You all will have received via email a guidance sheet PDF that included information that is contained in these slides. So hopefully you have had an opportunity to take a look at that. If not, please do make sure you received a copy. Let me know if you did not after the meeting. The contents of that we're going to be going over today. But I wanted to start with the overall TAC charge and an overview of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 2. So what this is outlining what DCR is planning to accomplish with this second phase of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. I want to just reiterate that we are doing an update to the previous phase one plan. So this is an update of phase one, which was released in December of 2021. And we're treating it as an update and really trying to address at its core what's outlined in code as requirements to have updated by December of 2024. That includes the updated flood hazard exposure model, the updated flood hazard risk assessment, and updating information on projects and initiatives that are underway or planned in the region. In addition to those components, we are
Thank you.
looking, please be sure to mute yourself if you are online. Thank you. We're also looking at financial need for flood resilience and then proposing to work with each of the TAC subcommittees to document recommendations for future planning efforts. This is in code. The Coastal Resilience Master Plan is in code as needing to be updated every 5 years. So we will be doing this process again. What we're proposing to produce in terms of deliverables are two major outputs. Firstly, an update to our existing Coastal Resilience Web Explorer, and secondly, a PDF document plan. Throughout this process, we plan to utilize outreach and engagement to collect feedback on each of these different components that I mentioned. And I'll talk about each of those in more detail. So included in that guidance sheet that I mentioned is this plan development timeline. You'll see at the top that we've got the meetings of the various subcommittees. There's 4 subcommittees of this TAC in total, as well as the TAC meetings. Those are occurring on a quarterly basis between now and December of 24 when the plan is due. Beneath that, the schedule includes in these colored bars the major components that I covered on the previous slide, as well as the TAC subcommittee that we are proposing be responsible for supporting the development of that particular component. So you'll notice for this subcommittee, we're proposing for you all to support us with the flood hazard risk assessment and the data collection that goes into that, as well as the analysis of the planned resilience actions, as well as the project initiative information collection that goes into that. And then finally, for all subcommittees, once again, we're proposing to work with you to develop TAC subcommittee recommendations for future planning. So for a little bit more detail on what we have in mind for the flood hazard risk assessment here, the purpose is to identify and understand vulnerabilities to flooding in order to facilitate the prioritization of limited resources for protection and adaptation. I'll talk more about the prioritization aspect of this in the slides to come, but really want to underscore that what we're trying to do is understand where the vulnerabilities to flooding exist across the coastal region. Some considerations to keep in mind. Firstly, the Chief Resilience Officer has a new requirement to produce a status of flood resilience report biennially. This code around this report provides some guidance as to what is critical infrastructure and what needs to be assessed for flood hazard vulnerability. That includes human, natural, and built infrastructure. So we'll talk about that on the next slide, but that is something that is new since the phase one plan was developed. Secondly, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management is proposing to create a new critical infrastructure program that would include a working group comprised of state agency regulators and owners, as well as private sector owners of critical infrastructure in Virginia. And one of their first goals would be to help identify what data already exists around critical infrastructure and where there are data gaps in critical infrastructure. So we'll talk more about this, but that is an opportunity to work together rather than trying to produce on our own critical infrastructure data. Finally, I'm sure you all are aware, there have been updates to the data that went into the phase one risk assessment, for example, census updates that may be worth considering. This slide provides some additional detail on the left, what was accomplished during the phase one impact assessment for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. We looked at 3 major areas: the community resources, critical sectors, and natural infrastructure, and crosswalking that with, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the status of flood resilience report, the areas of critical infrastructure that DCR has been looking at for meeting the requirements of that report. The human infrastructure and the built infrastructure components of the right-hand side are consistent with VDEM's proposed approach for critical infrastructure, the sectors that they are looking at as well. So we have already been working together with them to align those approaches. The natural infrastructure component is not something that VDEM is proposing to look at this time, but is something that we are required to look at for our status report, for the Chief Resilience Officer status report. You'll notice those categories are different than the phase 1 natural infrastructure categories, and we are looking for feedback on that from this subcommittee as well as from other experts within and outside of DCR to help us determine what are the best natural infrastructure categories that should be considered critical infrastructure for analysis. You'll notice that we don't have some of the community resources sectors on the right-hand side. That's not to say that we don't necessarily want to look at them in phase 2, but just highlighting that that's not something that we are required to look at for the status report. So today during this meeting, we are primarily going to focus on discussing outputs. Of course, if you have feedback on inputs, we're open to that as well, but we're reserving some time for that at our next meeting. But I wanted to share some information on baselines of where we think, at a minimum, we want to take the flood hazard risk assessment for phase 2. So at a minimum, we want to take what was done during phase 1 and apply our new flood hazard exposure modeling that's being done together with Dewberry and apply that to all of our assets. The potential additional updates that we're looking at for the risk assessment input data, aside from the flood hazard exposure component, is to look at those categories that are aligned with both the status report and the VDEM critical infrastructure working group. Reframing, as I mentioned on the previous slide, natural infrastructure categories and data sets, updating community resources data, and potentially updating community context data. So these are potential updates that we want feedback from the subcommittee on. So that flood hazard risk assessment was part 1 of what we're proposing to be this subcommittee's role in helping us to write phase 2. The second part of that is helping us with the planned resilience action. So this is the projects and initiatives across the region. Here, our proposed purpose is to understand the landscape of existing efforts and gaps in building flood resilience in the coastal region. As I mentioned before, with the second bullet here, we are not proposing to conduct project prioritization, nor committing funding to projects and initiatives that are submitted through the Web Explorer. So that is important to keep in mind. And then firstly, the first bullet, we are currently working on an update to our Coastal Resilience Web Explorer is to create a user portal. Our plan is to launch that in September, and the purpose of that will be to allow localities, planning district commissions, and other entities throughout the coastal region to submit information to DCR directly for upload into the Web Explorer about what projects and initiatives, as well as funding, they're currently working on or aware of in this region. DCR will be working on publicizing more information on how to use this portal and conducting outreach for that before the end of this plan. So with all of that context of what DCR is proposing to create for this phase 2 plan updates, these are the proposed subcommittee objectives in draft form for your feedback and discussion. Firstly, to inform and support the flood hazard risk assessment that we've discussed, specifically helping us look at asset data inputs, how we're quantifying the vulnerability of those assets, and then what outputs are going to best support decision-making, coordination, and collaboration for coastal resilience. Secondly, to inform and support identification of planned resilience actions. So specifically to help us review what we received from localities, planning district commissions, and others in terms of projects and initiatives, identify shared themes, gap trends between those, and some of our information on risk. And then finally, develop recommendations for future planning. Again, this is something we're proposing for each TAC subcommittee, and this will be kind of a facilitated process with you all. But some ideas for where this might head include where we might head in the future with developing that prioritization protocol for both needs and actions across the coastal region. We would propose starting with identifying some goals for what it is we're trying to accomplish, and going from there to look at how do I prioritize projects within those goals. Our proposed schedule for the subcommittee is shown on the screen here. So at this meeting today, we're primarily going to focus on risk assessment outputs. We'll transition to finish up hopefully the outputs at next meeting, and then start talking about risk assessment inputs. That inputs discussion will continue into Q1 of next year, and then we'll also start working on future plans, the recommendations. And then for the remaining meetings, we will look at that planned resilience action analysis and continue our discussion on recommendations for future planning. My final slide before we open it up to subcommittee discussion. We have the opportunity to appoint advisors to subcommittees. The Coastal Resilience Technical Advisory Committee Chair may appoint those advisors with recommendations from the subcommittee chair. Those advisors can participate in these subcommittee meeting discussions as non-voting members. Important to keep in mind that they are subject to the FOIA requirements. And then, so we're asking this subcommittee, are there any additional areas of expertise that could support this group with your goal based on who is currently on this subcommittee? And you do have that roster of current members from earlier in the slide deck available to you. So that is the first portion of my presentation. We'll open it up now to subcommittee discussion, and happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Everything's clear as mud.
Yeah. So there's nobody from EDA, right?
Oh, there's something.
I mean, that might be interesting if we're focusing on their work group. That may be all I can do this moment. That was a lot. Let's see. Go back.
And I can go back to any slides that we want to revisit.
Can you speak a little bit more on the prediction analysis, I guess, as it relates to some of the potential flood areas? I know you guys probably been talking about working with VDOM on identifying areas of impact.
Yes, so the work with VDOM is focused on all hazards, and this critical infrastructure working group is focused on all hazards. So that includes both natural hazards as well as man-made hazards. So their task is primarily on identifying critical infrastructure assets. That is primarily the purpose of this working group, as I understand it currently. And this is they're still working on their draft charter, so that is very much coming together still. So in terms of predicting the flood hazard exposure, that work is being conducted with Dewberry. We're proposing to use our existing analysis from phase 1 in terms of coastal hazards. We're currently working on updating our fluvial modeling with rainfall driven flooding to create that model for the coastal region. We're also looking at how we're going to be looking at riverine flooding data as well, and then whether we can create some sort of compound flooding analysis that will look at current conditions as well as projected out into the future with considerations of climate change, changes to sea level, as well as to fluvial flooding patterns. So that work is being discussed at the Research Data and Innovation Subcommittee that's meeting next week in further detail to get further direction on where we're headed. Does that answer the question?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can we go to maybe, okay, so on the crosswalk, are we informing or helping to inform the work that's being done on the right side of the screen? Or is this just showing us?
That's a good question. Yes, definitely in terms of the natural infrastructure, we are looking for help with identifying what that natural infrastructure is. We do think it is best for us to align our approach to human and built infrastructure with what VDEM is doing, because they are working with this critical infrastructure working group and have already defined these sectors as the focus of that work. I guess the question is that the right path? But we do envision working with VDEM and our critical infrastructure working group for everything except the natural infrastructure. A further question is, aside from these categories that are covered here with a phase 2 risk assessment or impact assessment, do we also want to look at community resources shown on the left and any other kind of categories? And this gets back to this slide on potential data inputs, including these potential updates. As I said, at a minimum, we're planning to use the assets that were included from phase 1 and just update the risk assessment against the flood hazard exposure modeling, but are looking for feedback on. Aside from that, what else does the subcommittee think is important for risk assessment updates? And that includes this slide as well as potentially other categories.
So you already kind of assessed this. I mean, like, it's a lot to look at these 2 lists, but so like one of the things would be if we align the coastal master plan, right, with this flood resilience report, the way it stands, you would throw out the analysis of residential structure, right? It's not said, right? It's not in the.
I don't think we are considering ourselves limited to these 3 categories. We do think it's important to also look at the community resources category from the left for phase 2, even though it's not in the status report.
It's just kind of hard, like I said, those are 2 long lists, so I'm like,
Yeah.
huh. That's the one that I was like, well, that's really odd.
Feedback received, thank you.
Yeah, okay. And what is protected landscape resilience?
So these categories shown under natural infrastructure were taken from a different DCR program that was looking at these categorizing different areas of natural infrastructure. I don't have off the top of my head what exactly is included in that, but we are in conversations with folks within DCR to look at changing those and are probably headed in a different direction. We just haven't defined that yet, what that looks like exactly. So they are predefined categories from within DCR. I think it's in the Conserve Virginia. Is that right?
That makes sense. I
Yeah.
just wanted to double check. How do you like water quality infrastructure layer? That's the last one under natural. Water quality. I know, but it's just, have y'all thought about how you think what that means?
Yeah, so that layer already exists.
It does.
Yes, Conserve Virginia has already created all of these layers.
It's
So-
weird names. Gotcha.
I would suggest we're gonna have an opportunity to discuss flood hazard assessment inputs, which is all of this stuff at the next meeting. That is proposed to be the primary purpose of the next meeting. Here, some questions for you all to consider. Firstly about the advisors, but also, are these the right, zooming out a little bit, are these the right objectives for this subcommittee? Do you have any feedback or questions or comments on what it is we are proposing that this subcommittee focus on over the next 6 meetings, 5 meetings?
We talk about how recommendations are implemented. Number 3.
So those recommendations would be made to DCR to consider as we're working toward our next plan update. So we would document those in the plan and then pick them back up. The goal would be to pick them back up as we start working on the next update of the coastal resilience master plan and designing that process and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think this is good as long as there's a way to sort of track progress with all these items. That's really my big takeaway. great to come up with some solid recommendations. How do we track it? How do we ensure that we're actually?
So I think I am wondering, are we talking about project like types? Or are we talking about specific projects in terms of prioritizing?
For the recommendations for future planning or for the contents of this plan?
I think both. Because in number 2, I know it's specific projects, because that's what's been submitted, and I assume we're gonna talk about why all aren't submitted and where the gaps are and all that kind of stuff. But I think I heard you say that we're not creating a prioritization framework. So y'all are gonna provide the framework, and then we're gonna talk about like buckets of projects that could fit within the framework.
So we are not proposing to prioritize projects in phase 2 of the coastal resilience master plan. We do think that it could be an opportunity for you all to help us define what that prioritization looks like for future plans. So it would only come up under, we're proposing that it would only come up under this 3rd bullet. We would not be presenting to you all kind of a matrix for how we would go about prioritizing or anything like that. We would just be looking, this analysis would be more focused on what are the themes, where are the gaps, not individual projects, what's good and what's not in the eyes of the state.
State funded planning project.
Not all the projects that will be submitted will have received state funding.
Correct. I'm sorry. Yes.
So it's all resilience projects that localities and PDCs have submitted. We can talk about whether there needs to be some sort of filtering of that prior to it coming to the subcommittee as well.
That was gonna be my question. There are a list of projects that should in the legs. So, or that's you get a, I guess, a number of that.
Yes. There is in the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer currently a collected list of projects and initiatives that were collected during phase 1. We know that there are gaps, that there are many localities that did not submit projects. So there are definitely gaps in that data. With the phase 2, what we're proposing is to, again, use this user portal to allow localities and PDCs to submit projects to us on an ongoing basis, but to put kind of a deadline for them that's well publicized and made available, that this is the cutoff date for when your projects will come to this subcommittee and to the planning for consideration. That would kind of give us that list of projects to then conduct this, identifying themes, gaps, trends, etc. So in terms of the schedule, we're not proposing to start looking at those planned resilience actions until Q2 of next year, because we want to give localities and PDCs enough time to submit things and to be aware of the deadline and be familiar with the user portal before setting that deadline.
So just make sure I'm understanding. Right now, there are projects from phase 1 that have already been prioritized.
No, there are projects that are inventoried, but we have not prioritized them. This subcommittee did discuss extensively, I was not here in this role at the time, but did discuss extensively project prioritization in the last iteration of the plan, but did not ultimately produce a kind of final schema for how projects would be prioritized.
So the goal for this subcommittee is to help find themes that we want to prioritize so that those projects can be prioritized within those themes.
The goal of this subcommittee we're proposing is just to identify themes.
Okay.
And then perhaps use those themes to recommend to the department how we might prioritize projects in future plans. I know it's
Sorry.
a lot. No,
I'm new to this
helpful.
too.
And you said goals too.
So under this recommendations for future planning, we think we would recommend to the subcommittee, rather than trying to start straight from a list of projects and maybe a list of themes, rather setting goals, maybe for each kind of area of analysis on this is what we as a Commonwealth think we should be working toward in terms of a coastal resilient future. And then once we've got that idea, it might become more easy to identify how we prioritize projects to meet that goal. That's all.
Are we to come away with these things today?
No,
Okay.
And, you mentioned there'll be a review of projects submitted
for number 2.
for number 2.
And
And so,
I think it's what you said.
so the projects are submitted and then not this subcommittee, the DCR is gonna review them and say, this project gets a score A, this project.
No, we're not gonna score, we're gonna review them and maybe help organize it in a way for the subcommittee to look at and digest, because, you know, we know that there's limited time, but we're not gonna prioritize or score or rank anything.
Are we gonna link them with potential funding sources? Like, what's the incentive for anybody to submit a project?
Yeah.
How can we help support through technical assistance, someone like?
We are looking at whether it will be possible. Currently, many of you might know that the Web Explorer does align projects that are in the Web Explorer to funding that is in the Web Explorer. We are looking at whether that will be possible. We can't commit that it definitely will with the new user portal, because things are going to be updated on an ongoing basis. There'll need to be some development of that kind of real-time alignment that would need to happen. I'm not a developer, so don't ask me about the details. So we're looking at that. You're correct that the incentive for participation is a challenge that we've identified, and we're going to talk about with the Outreach and Coordination Subcommittee as well in detail. We recognize that similarly to phase 1, it is something that will be a barrier to overcome. I do think that the Web Explorer list of projects has been helpful in certain applications, and would be open to hearing your feedback on that, if that is true or not. For example, CZM I know has used that Web Explorer database to help look at projects as funding becomes available, particularly as it becomes available on short timelines, and we're trying to help localities along with their efforts. So it may be more of an indirect benefit, but I think there still is a benefit to including your projects in this database and sharing that information with the state.
So what is the purpose of prioritizing the projects that are submitted
You mean for future planning efforts?
for number 2?
We're not prioritizing projects that are submitted. But for future efforts, a benefit, we foresee in future efforts, there may be an opportunity to more clearly link prioritized projects through this plan with funding. That is a potential, something that could happen with future plans, which is why we're looking for help identifying the prioritization for recommendations for future planning. But again, we're not proposing to prioritize projects in this plan.
So essentially find the themes, possibly prioritize the gaps for later on.
Find the themes and the gaps, maybe not prioritize the gaps. Maybe, but maybe not.
And the timeline, the timeline for the potential funding database and the alignment of the two, just knowing how much federal money there is right now.
Well, the user portal is close. It really, nothing significant has changed in the schema. Like, there's still the opportunity to take what we did in phase 1 and use the match. So it's very doable.
2024.
We don't have a schedule. It's not in the current scope of work.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, the current scope is really focused on editing and updating the database, getting projects into it. Then it would be an additional step to then do that crosswalk between this is a new project and we are adding new funding opportunities too, which ones work for each of them.
There's a subcommittee for that work.
That's,
I'm just joking.
there is a funding subcommittee that they're not necessarily focused on this. I think that's more this subcommittee.
It's not fully made, like there's gonna be addition of the data for the projects and for the funding sources. But within that, we've identified the key attributes related to the projects themselves and the funding to help like automate some level of that alignment to see if it's a suitable project for the funding source.
So a slightly different question that's probably maybe not for the subcommittee, but with finding the shared themes, is there a way to say that, okay, two people submitted a similar project really close to one another? What if we did a regional effort together?
Yeah, I think that that is a good role for this plan and for this subcommittee to consider. Helping to identify where there are commonalities and opportunities for localities to be working together that maybe they're not already aware of.
We're gonna be developing protocols, I think inherently in there, we're kind of identifying what is success in the Commonwealth. So does this committee think it's appropriate to be explicit that we need to start defining metrics and how we're going to, again, measure success? You know, I don't think we can evaluate one project over another unless we know what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there needs to be, and that's part of what I was talking about in terms of how do we track recommendations. But to Chris's point, there needs to be some sort of metrics to measure, the definition of done, what's successful, what isn't.
I'm sorry, said that.
What the mention of identifying goals first.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we can update these sub-bullets to focus on identifying goals and metrics before focusing on how we prioritize projects.
I like that. Well, I think it's also important for us to think about. What's the point? What's the desired action? And what is the stage goal in that, right? What is the stage goal in accomplishing these projects with these actions? I think that connection has not yet been made explicit. The vast majority of the proposed projects from phase one were all local projects that were being submitted that they were already under consideration or approval at the level. And there's no, we know there's no direct connection between the current master plan and any funding or any other decision making at the state level. And so making that connection more explicit, or if we can't make that connection explicit, then it becomes a matter of, are we evaluating projects so that we can say that the state supports these things versus other things? I think that's a discussion that has to take place. I think it's very helpful figuring out kind of what are we trying to do with this plan, and then help make the plan more useful. Prioritization is a decision, right? If it's not tied to the decision, then it sounds good, but it doesn't really. If we could rank all the projects that are in there right now, we wouldn't be able to do anything with that ranking.
Right. This is essentially assuming that we are going to make explicit some decisions or some funding tied to project prioritization with future plans, which is, as you say, not necessarily been fully established. Yeah, I think we can consider how to build that into the discussion of recommendations for future planning. Any other questions or comments? Any thoughts on subcommittee advisors beyond Dina?
Local government staff. Yeah, it's, I mean, the teams have been present. But I know that the people put out. how you select it, I know that becomes a problem, but. that'd be helpful. Yeah, well, and then maybe waive the online requirements for those people. Well, they're not voting, so they shouldn't have the same requirements. I think that's really helpful.
Oh, they're subject.
They're subject to the board.
Yeah. Right, well,
Oh, so they are subject, oh,
Remote or not, you're subject. Yeah.
well, could they be remote? Yeah.
They
And
can
not,
be remote. They won't have a vote being remote, but
well, they don't, yeah, I guess they don't have a vote. Well, that would be a huge burden, but
they don't have a vote, they don't count towards quorum.
Right. The virtual participation options are gonna be brought up at the September TAC meeting. Expanding the 60-mile rule as another option for virtual participation. If a member is located more than 60 miles from the meeting, they have unlimited virtual participation in an in-person meeting. And then there's also up for a vote is the all virtual option, where an entire committee or subcommittee meeting can happen fully virtually, but it cannot happen on consecutive meetings and no more than two. I guess it would be kind of every other has the option to be a virtual. So there are some increased options for virtual participation in in-person meetings, as well as all virtual options coming up. But as we consider adding more people, advisors are members of the public body. And so they're still subject to the FOIA requirements. And the key one being, you have 3 people of the public body discussing the public body's work, that triggers a public meeting that needs to be noticed and happened in a public forum. And so we have the ability to have presenters come in and provide information and share, and guest speakers, but if they're to be a member of the body, they're subject to the FOIA requirements.
you said that the following meeting after this one is gonna talk about the natural infrastructure component, so. I think maybe we could do like a. Experts come to this meeting on natural infrastructure, so we could include people from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. You know, like quality studies, wetlands, loss, wetlands migration, sea level rise impacts, those features. You know, similarly, someone from the floodplain space, unless the resilience PCR staff can handle that. But maybe someone from the Virginia Floodplain Management Association would be good to speak to some of those issues. I don't know if those people would want to be included as an advisor for the whole, you know, caboodle, but if they wanted to at least participate in a subject-specific meeting, that would be helpful to hear a diverse range of voices. Water quality, I think we should probably have.
Did you say somebody from DEQ?
Yes, or someone from, you know. Commission or something like that.
Do you want to ask a follow-up to the locality suggestion? Do other subcommittee members have, especially after this discussion about FOIA requirements, additional thoughts on if we should identify localities or invite localities to be advisors or invite them to present? And if so, how we might prioritize which localities to include?
Well, I'll make a motion to do that. If anyone wants to second it. Add localities.
Have a motion, is there a second? Second. All in favor? Aye.
And maybe the discussion,
Wait 1 second, I'm sorry, just for formalities, we do have an official motion. All in favor? Aye. 2. But add more now, add more now. The question. So this says here that the TAC chair can appoint advisor to the subcommittees, recommendation to the subcommittee chair. So we need to take a question or act on it. That's within your purview. You think we should have, you should advise the TAC, the chair.
We need to vote on that and all that.
It's, no, but if the chair wishes to conduct a survey of the members, to see if there's support and consensus for that, they can do.
So that's kind of essentially what I'm doing, because you guys are the experts, right?
I will follow up with that. So I don't have, do you have any names? I think that if you don't have any specific people in mind yet, then I don't think it's really able to put in the carpet for the course. When it comes to adding advisors to the committee presentations, I think we could come up with a few, localities that have gone through similar exercises. Have them come and talk about their experiences, what works, what doesn't work for them, why it worked. But I don't know, unless anybody's got specific folks in mind for advisors, I haven't arrived at any things myself.
I think we have to ask people and talk a little bit more about, the pockets of representation that might really be missing. I believe Jessica Spielman has taken a step back, and so maybe having some of those to ensure that as, from a locality that's done along the projects would be useful. But I agree, if we don't have a name, if we don't have a commitment of somebody that they might want to serve, they might say, no thanks, of course.
Well, why don't we table that as an action item and follow up on that?
Yeah, and I think if there's a meeting where we're gonna talk about maybe submission of these projects, we could invite people from local governments to participate electronically and provide their insight. So, I'm not that set on making a decision today, but I think opening it up for discussion and to try to see if that's more interesting, especially where there are gaps.
Okay, so focusing on areas of where we haven't heard from localities as much is the priority.
Wouldn't be for me.
Okay.
It'd be more like people who have projects, whether they want the state to, how they want state to play in this game.
Yes, right.
So that's another group of people that's the Norfolk, Virginia, and they're, at least for our region, might have an opinion about whether or not it's advantageous, helpful to have, certain metrics and criteria, or they're like, you're not helping. You're not. But I agree, there's also people who, it's like a different step in this process that might have input. It's just hard to say advisors. I mean, it might be easier to take topics and have people participate. This is kind of weird. I mean, it's new. I'm trying to think it through.
I do think our local governments are completely different places all across the coastal belt, and so it's like light years from what's going on in Hampton Roads and what's going on the way back. Just light years. So I think any perspective on that is going to be helpful.
Okay. Well, also, I'd be kind of curious. Not a lot of idea. This is the problem with this. Maybe some of the localities who went through the grant process, like they might have a perspective on, because it's very seems similar but a different scale. But I don't know that I'm really active.
And it's on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. There's no further comments or questions. We can move on. And again, there's more, we're going to talk about flood hazard risk assessment output, so there is more opportunity for discussion specifically on this section. But if there want to make sure to capture any feedback on the role of the subcommittee at this time and advisors.
Like, if we think we need goals, don't we need the goals before we do anything else?
The goals would be recommendations for future planning. At this point, we are not proposing to create goals that would be included in this plan itself. we're focusing on meeting code requirements and updating phase one with the flood hazard exposure update, risk assessment update, and the list, the inventory, I should say, of projects and initiatives.
I'll follow your lead, but I would say that just looking at the next section of outputs, I'm like, picking outputs would be informed, in my opinion, by goals. Like, it's kind of, the outputs are kind of like metrics potentially, right?
But this is from the first round, right?
We're gonna talk about what was produced in phase one and then have some discussion about what should be produced in phase two.
So it seems like the projects that are being put into the website could possibly help direct us into what the goals and stuff might be for future projects. So
We won't have that information
Yeah.
for a couple more quarters at least. Okay, great. I will jump into these slides on flood hazard risk assessment, and then we'll have additional opportunity for comments and questions. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about, again, in a little bit more detail, what was completed under the phase one impact assessment. We do have our friends from Dewberry in the back of the room. As I mentioned, I was not here with DCR at the time, so they can help answer any detailed questions. I would also direct the subcommittee to Appendix E of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan Phase 1, which does include details on the impact assessment methods as well as the data inputs. So in terms of community resources, shown here on the screen are the different categories that were included in the phase one impact assessment, as well as similarly for critical sectors and natural infrastructure. These are consistent with what was on the left-hand side of that previous slide. We included in the plan itself, this is a screenshot of the PDF document, a list of the, or rather a narrative of the impacts across these different categories, as well as maps of exposure and vulnerability of these different assets. So you can see what that looks like here. It's also framed in the context of different regions. Some of you may remember that we had specific regions within the overall coastal region that were used during phase one. So this shows one of those for rural coastal Virginia. Again, combining this kind of narrative information on where different assets existed. You can see these call outs for national wildlife refuges and other assets, as well as data on expected impacts over different time periods. 2020, here we're looking at for example, tidal wetlands acres impacted between 2020 and 2080 with a difference in what that change looked like in percentages. In addition, we produced the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. This is a screenshot of that Web Explorer. There's a tab for impacts that includes community resources, critical sectors, and natural infrastructure, those same three that were looked at in the assessment that we saw on the previous slide, the list of the categories. Here if you could zoom in, you could narrow it down to look at the different coastal flood time horizons that were available between 2020 and 2080, as well as select an area of interest, looking at the region as a whole, looking at a PDC, or looking at a locality. We also have the tabular data available for download from the website, which again provides the same types of information in this Excel file format. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see some of the metrics that were used to understand the impacts for these different types of assets. So things like assets exposed to flooding, annual likelihood of flooding, population exposed to flooding, population displaced, etc. And all of these are described in detail in Appendix E of the phase one plan. We also included information on community context, which used 2018 reference data with social vulnerability index. That was combined with information on coastal flood hazard that was produced during phase one to result in this community context viewer online. It was also included in the plan itself. Again, looking across different coastal flood time horizons at social vulnerability and flood hazard exposure on similar on the same continuum. So you can compare the two and kind of see areas where both social vulnerability and flood hazard exposure are high to help prioritize historically underserved communities. So we have some information on how the Web Explorer is being used and how the online data is being used. We know that we're currently averaging around 380 visits a month this year. But we unfortunately don't have great information right now on who is using the data, which data they're using, and how they're using it. So that is a gap in our knowledge. We're going to talk about that a little bit today with the discussion questions. This is, you've seen this before, we've talked about it extensively. We don't need to talk about it more. This is phase 1 and our status of flood resilience report. And I'll pause here to ask if there's any questions because the remainder of this slide deck is just discussion questions for the tax consideration. We are looking for your feedback on what the outputs for phase 2 should look like, considering what was done during phase 1, considering our timeline for creating this for phase 2, and what our top priorities to Ben's point, you know, what is going to be most useful? How is this plan being used or useful to localities and PDCs and non-governmental organizations and others in the Commonwealth? And we can also answer any questions about the phase 1 assessment at this time.
Anything available as to high level takeaways from phase 1 impact? So maybe as a memory of refresh. I don't remember exactly what's.
The plan itself tries to highlight across the different sectors some of the data. It's hard at this scale to get some big takeaways, and maybe that's some of the questions we have. Are there questions you want to answer to help with your all's planning as well? That's part of the role of DCRs to make information available for localities and regions for their planning purposes. And so if you have questions that you want, was there data that was provided that was useful? Is there some data you didn't use? Maybe we should include in the next impact assessment. This goes towards the larger themes kind of, and what is the whole region trying to accomplish? We didn't establish that and looking for input. So if the whole region wants to, actually, I don't want to throw anything out there, but if there are some beyond an individual locality has set some projects they want to do, a PDC has set projects. We don't have many things that say, you know what, this PDC, as a region, we all agree we need to be doing this. So we're looking for how we can do that, inform that data. I mean, some of the key takeaways were just the acceleration of the impacts with sea level rise. We've kind of built up to the regulatory limits of the floodplains, and as those floodplains expand due to changing weather patterns and sea level rise, we're going to have a lot more exposure to both our built, natural, and human infrastructure. And the impacts of that, we have some average annualized loss numbers, some people, human impacts. They are staggering, but we're trying to understand, are they driving people towards action? Do we need different information to try to drive towards action? So we're looking for your input. We could do the same thing again for phase 2 and repeat it, but we want to try to have it be useful for you all as well. So that's what we're looking to see what can we have as far as input. But we could provide, I don't have the manual in front of me, and I don't have a kind of a one sheet of some of the key impacts. I know we do have some of like the road, the amount of roads that are projected to here's the thing. Yes. So we do have some key, like number of roadway miles, a 460% increase. through probably 2080. So we have some, right, it isn't that meaningful. So what would be more meaningful? We're looking for everyone on how to present these outputs. And then based on what you want us to try to present in outputs, we can look and see what needs to go into that to try to get to those answers.
How narrowed down does the mapping go? Like how zoomed in?
I mean, you can zoom in pretty far and see, I mean, you can click anywhere on the map and see the change over time as exposure. The data is aggregated at the locality level. So any county or city can pull their information. The PDC, it's grouped in there, and then we have the whole state.
So they would be able to tell like which roads.
Yes.
Okay.
While we're talking about roads, one of the things that we're trying to do with VDOT is kind of advance our knowledge, if you will. We have data sets like this, and we have used the phase 1 impact assessment to kind of inform our next steps. One of the things we're trying to do is better understand or balance. We know we have assets that are vulnerable or exposed, but what does that mean, not from just that individual asset, but the system as a whole? So, we've been working with VDAM from critical infrastructure, from their definition, but we're also kind of expanding that definition to understand, what are some of the day-to-day community services that may be needed in that local community. I'm trying to do like a network analysis from that perspective. We're also looking at what does VDOT need to maintain critical operational and maintenance services. So I'm not sure, as we sit here today, how that analysis will feed into the phase 2 efforts or vice versa. But that is kind of what we're looking at. It's not just about, hey, that asset is flooded. What's its criticality to the overall system? That's what we're trying to figure out right now.
One of the things that's missing, and I'm not sure exactly how to present the data, but making it so that the people in like that, at least at a locality scale, I don't know what the right scale is, but trying to say like, what's going to be flooded, like for what duration and what frequency, it's kind of missing. And then like there's another piece of like and when the water recedes, is there a big build back problem? Like, it's just all lumped together. And that's why I would say, if we say this number of miles of road, you're like, well, was that in this year, if a huge event happens, that will probably only last 48 hours. It's really hard to.
So Molly
think about what
is
you do.
helping with the number of hours of inundation. The build back, it's the classic trip or data rich information for. We're trying to layer in pavement conditions to understand if they've been inundated for so long, what's the chance that they'll quicken degradation. So we're trying to better understand, is this pavement more suitable to pull that? And I'm not talking pavement type, just how long it's been out there, what is this condition assessment? And we expect that part of the facility to we're trying to figure that out right now.
And I feel like that also could be applied, that question to residential buildings, critical, like hospitals, because it just all kind of gets lumped together. Like there's this much, the value of this infrastructure, you put a number on it and say it's at risk, but it doesn't really tell you.
Correct. That's what we're trying to figure out.
Do we
have a
care?
lot of risk, and we're trying to figure out where do we need to really focus as well.
Well, and how much money are we gonna spend? It's from, the road standpoint, how many days of inundation is too many for reinvestment in repaving or in maintaining the road as viable at all. And that's what we've heard that would be really helpful to planning staff as they're trying to find the funding to ensure that they can keep paving or raise the road, but they don't want to invest the resources if the benefit isn't going to be specific.
And so I think that point, Matt's point, we see it as kind of like a feedback loop, both from the state to localities, but the localities to the state. If we see a road road segment that says it's not worth the operational costs, what do we do? But we need to hear from the locality, what are they planning to do on the other side of that asset? Are they going to invest in that? Which may prompt us to figure out a way to do that, or maybe the locality would say, no, we're not willing to invest for that community level. And I should be careful with those words, but that will help us, what we might decide to do with that facility. So I don't think either entity can really, make that signal.
Yeah. It's one of like 7,000. At a time, local government road by road. The scale of it is terrifying. That's why the number of census here. But the scale has been helpful. I will say your question, who's using this data, in grant writing, and Carolyn, you referred to this earlier. It's helpful data. I mean, for our message, 89% loss out of wetlands. That's helpful and very harmful. But it helps raise the alarm, and so it's giving people information that they might need to sway decision makers. But if you already have everybody on board and everybody's team, this is bad, it's the next step that I think has been really difficult. But I wonder, have you surveyed local governments to see who's used the impact assessment from phase one in planning or in decision making or even in outreach or like media?
That's my knowledge.
Not as official survey, reached out so few to hear what's going on. And some people requested information or asked us how to get to the certain information that's available, but no, I mean, and that could be whether it's part of outreach engagement or something here that could be a recommendation.
Can I ask those in the room, have you used for yourself, for your own purposes, the phase one risk impact assessment?
We have used the coastal flooding, coastal flooding data a lot, but we run into kind of what this conversation has been hinting at is that a lot of the information that we pull from the broad risk assessment is great as a starting bullet point or two, but then we end up needing to bring it over some additional information. And so what does it actually do here? Like, pull out. Everybody's already been talking about. We're plugging that into various planning processes. We have a scenario planning project that we're working on. It's being fed into several scenarios. So we are absolutely using the data, but the impact assessment is kind of easily accessed online. Some of the summaries are useful and we can reference them, but we end up kind of needing to narrow in or either because of the project at hand or the situation really define what this means on a broad scale. But it has been good data.
Sarah, are you downloading the tabular data or just using the viewers?
We download the data. I'm not saying we've never used a viewer to pull a quick statement, but yeah.
One of the gaps, I think, in the is it doesn't necessarily identify places that flood now, right? Because drainage issues, drainage capacity issues. And there's just, I think there's a lot of work being done on the short term, like horizon, like that road floods, that neighborhood floods. So I don't know that we aspire to use this plan to do that, but it is a little bit of a gap.
I was actually gonna ask, because where I'm from, there's a lot of mountains and stuff, and so like, if a river crosses it, that's the only way out. So everybody on the mountain is stuck in case of a flood or in case of snow. So like, I didn't know if there was data of like, if this road floods here, this many people are affected or trapped.
We're finding a lot of our current flooding is recorded within our residency offices, so we're trying to find a way to bring that to a statewide database or understanding.
We've done some modeling, look at the impacts that you have in a certain flooding scenario. So that certain roadways are underwater, depending on depth, how does that impact access to traffic behavior? We haven't done anything higher and that's just been out of the city.
I was just thinking that that could be kind of like help with prioritization, like a lot more people are gonna be affected if this road floods versus this road.
Right. Well, and we're, so that's something that our transportation planning organization is working on right now, figure out how to incorporate these things into their long range planning process. As one.
Yeah, so y'all have more extreme situations. We usually just go rapid.
Well,
But not always, I mean, on the Eastern Shore, so the VDOT study that was done, with the PDC prior to like some bigger one, yeah, many years ago, didn't that one show how many people, how many structures would be, like, really, like, no access at all on some of those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm always looking to update that, with her efforts, kind of flag two terms, what's impassable and what's inaccessible. So when that road becomes impassable, what becomes an accessible line? And so we're trying to quantify what is kind of now like isolated. We're looking at network analysis that we're redundancy that we did. We're also looking at the interest or like critical community services to understand even if the community isn't cut off, but maybe there's that same service that might be it's cut off, and then that could, yeah. So, may not just think about community and the number behind it, but it's like still have service, right?
And how many hours? Because if the water recedes in 2 hours, maybe somebody, you know, labor will they'll be okay before the baby comes. And that kind of thing. That's what I look at.
Yeah, we asked somebody this work because this isn't my own job, but we must work because it got snowed in, and there was snow on up a mountain road that isn't a priority. So that happened.
Well, you know, we've been talking about that, but there is an equivalent. I mean, like, in terms of if a hurricane's coming, like, you gotta stay home. We're not gonna be able to build the way out of that risk.
Yeah.
And trying to figure out what the threshold is of, you know, things should operate normally in these scenarios. You're gonna try to build to that, and then beyond this, you know, there's not gonna be public protection. Very hard to define.
So I think, you know, trying to connect this back to this plan or the assessment. When we talk about how we're assessing impacts, I think finding things clearly critical. So when I hear Chris talk about inaccessible or impassable roadways, well, what does that mean, right? Or we're thinking a certain depth of flooding, right? Well, how many inches of water on the road?
So our modeling is 6 inches just from a model sensitivity, but we as an agency will maintain if it's flooded. So we be careful how we message that.
Right, so I think, you know, that's if we're measuring things, being precise and like how we actually define where that point is, right? So for our work, we had different thresholds that we looked at. We went a little bit deeper, I think, that is actually saying, well, if there's 2 inches of water on the road, you know, people are going to drive, but maybe they'll slow down a little bit. If there's 6 inches, we're going to consider that, maybe 6 inches instead of impassable, maybe a foot is impassable. And it's different things, right? So for different, you know, for commuters, if we're modeling things, we also don't want to be hopeful, right? We want to try to reflect more about things, let people actually do this information that they know. And unfortunately, where we're at, and I'm sure this is, you know, what happens throughout the Virginia. There are areas that flood, people drive through the water, and you can tell that turn around, look around, car spec and other paths, just, they get.
Amateur, yeah.
So, but, you know, when it comes
Say it in the
to,
mic.
but when it comes to decision making about maintaining infrastructure, what those thresholds are, those tolerances for pain, you know, where is the point where we say enough is enough? And we're not going to keep doing this anymore. We haven't gotten to that point yet, really, with any of our infrastructure. But one of the things that this plan, I think, could help with is to frame that question so that when we are thinking about decisions 20, 30, 40 years from now about building new assets, and decisions about whether or not to reroute a major highway, that we've already thought through and come up with a methodical process for making that decision about how to balance the costs and the benefits. There's something, you know, with these maps that show, you know, what the impacts are. I think it would be very helpful to be more specific about what the impacts actually are, which impacts we're talking about. But also, you know, there's no direction, no kind of, there's nothing in here, especially when we look at the one that just has the different, you know, probability events, which is not really that, but I'm just looking through. Actually, look at anything. But if you think of the one that's got the 0.2, the 0.1, the, you know, the 1, the 2, the 5, like, there's nothing on that map.
I think I know. 1 year.
2% annual exceeded stance, 0.1%, you know, and then we see the stance, 1% more, whatever. And then we added sea level rise. You know, we've got all that series of maps. What are people supposed to do? How is that supposed to change their decision if they are that they would otherwise make differently? There's nothing in these impact assessments that points to a point where it says, well, if you're in the 0.2% annual chance area, then, you know, maybe you should make sure that your house is higher than the, you know, the surrounding grade, you know, or it's higher than the crowd at the nearest road. But otherwise, you're pretty quiet. You know, you don't need to run for the hills if that's where you're in. But if you're in the 50% chance of, you know, with 2 feet of sea level rise, you might want to think about moving. Because you don't want to be there because it's going to start getting wet a lot. And that sort of direction that really, I think, that ties directly to a kind of a choice that somebody, an entity, an organization, individual might make, that's absent right now. There's no, I mean, I know we use color to kind of differentiate between different probabilities that are on the maps, and we use color to differentiate between different time periods, but there's really nothing there to actually say what to do with those different colors. It's just a pretty map.
I think this gets back to your earlier point as well as about what is the function of this plan? What are we trying to accomplish? Are we trying to inform individual decisions with this plan about who should consider moving? Is that a goal of this plan? Is it not? I think that informs what the output, to your point, what that looks like.
I'll just say, I agree with the point that it's making. We have not figured out how to navigate this yet. We're looking at different probabilities, different, you know, scenarios. But what we're doing right now, Vince, is we're looking at it more as a depth model as opposed to a probability model. So we're just playing with the different depths that can happen, watching how the system behaves. So we think that's pretty informative. We'll continue to figure out, all right, if we look to do adaptive design criteria, what probability design. But right now, our assessment is looking at how the system behaves, what gets flooded, what gets impassable, accessible, using just different depths that are understandable. And when we hit a certain depth, we are trying to correlate it. Hey, this also equivalent to this scenario. So that, you know, that can help it more, but we're not to the point of understanding what probability it is. So,
You might get there faster than anyone else. Well, I don't know. You guys are sort of leading the charge with the agencies. So I would suspect all of your assessment, and you're going deeper than this effort is, which makes sense with more aggressive. So perhaps it makes sense to, you know, take our direction from what that comes up with, and then it helps inform some of the decision that's passed down. You know, we do that with development of standards and floodplain management that DCR comes in with.
Yeah, I would just add to that maybe. I think we want to be mindful that we are very focused on transportation.
Oh, right, I meant with roads. Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to.
I think that's a great point though, and that's why we're working with the critical infrastructure group. DCR is not an asset owner by and large. I mean, we have some state parks, some national reserve areas, but VDOT owns transportation. The other lead state agencies are responsible for other transport or other critical systems, whether it's our hospitals, healthcare service, emergency services. And we are not the impact expert, and we're not trying to claim to be. They know more about their assets, just like the localities know about the local impacts more than we'll be able to do at scale as well. So trying to figure out then where we fit in, we're able to provide this broad scale flooding, just the coastal flood, right? And we're working on getting the rainfall driven at scale across the whole region, trying to see what we can do with the available FEMA fluvial data. So we're trying to provide this complete total flood hazard information. And with the critical infrastructure owners trying to say, all right, now you want to do the assessment maybe because you have sensitive information you don't want to share with us. And you're the ones that will be making decisions about how to address your asset. We are not making decisions for VDOT or for other asset owners. We're not making decisions really for localities or PDCs. We're trying to facilitate the process and coordinate it so that we can try to see where there's some things at scale, some commonality across this region that we can try to provide the state as a resource to try to link those things together.
So I think, thank you back to that. I think one of the points that Chris just mentioned is that you're looking at now. And one of the things, and I know that, we're in some ways we're tied to the, intermediate high curve for some things. Yeah. But to make this, I think one concrete thing that could be done, make this even more useful tool, would be to, instead of using these, I don't know, 5 levels of sea level rise projections from down 2100 that are all tied to that one curve. So look at it instead from just increments, regular increments of sea level rise, and then you can relate this back to any curve. But by doing it, we done something like that in our work several years ago. It sounds like we're doing the same thing. 6-inch increments, then 8 feet of sea level rise, and then you can you get a much finer grade of analysis that you can see kind of where some of those tipping points might be. Which is another thing that's not really this isn't a fine enough analysis to really see where those are. Within, is it 3 feet where it really starts to get bad? Is it 3.5, 4 for different types of assets? But I think also, a lot of our localities, they're working in different funding programs. And each of the federal agencies, I think, for the moment, seem to be kind of able to pick and choose which sea level rise scenarios and curves they get to use. So I know that the Corps, for example, has their own set of curves that are not directly related to the NOAA curves, right? So switching to a different format where we're looking at different levels, I think will allow the colonies to more readily use what's in the plan to do some of that initial work and then tie that to the things we're trying to do with federal funding partners.
We are going to talk about that in the research data and innovation subcommittee, but I think this subcommittee can inform kind of scenario plans as well. Instead of, right, we have 4 different time periods and 7 different return intervals. Are there like 3? You just want 3 scenarios to consider, or how do you want the outputs? Should we simplify? I want all. Well, there's underlying data and what's reported too. So trying to help us understand what's more useful way to report this information out. That is more either readable and digestible, more actionable.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. So for the analysis, we do have depth information for at least every structure and point and roadway that we looked at. under, I think, 40 or so different scenarios, if you take the events and then the events over the different time horizons. I think a big challenge with this, we have so much of that information down to the individual residential structure level. And that's what we use to generate that average annualized loss and values of the depth damage functions associated with that. But how are we summarizing it to make it approachable or engaging for all of these various audiences that we're trying to serve, whether it's the individual resident, the planner, the engineer. So there's a lot of decisions that went on to that. That's why, you know, there's a lot more summary, high level, where are your hotspots kind of in the report. You get down to that summary level at the gridded level in the web viewer. But yeah, so there is a lot more rich information. I think that looking for like who are your primary audiences or what information is most helpful to summarize, be really helpful for that next iteration of how we package or where we continue to develop.
So if we were looking at house elevations and we wanted to see like who would be most, who needs it the most, would we be able to look at that on like a mapping system and say like these houses need an elevation? Like, I mean, obviously Western Coast, but upriver.
I mean, yes, we have the data. So we have all the depth grids, we have all the flood extents that are downloadable. Can you make those decisions in the current web explorer? Probably not. For your whole community, but there are ways you work with the data to do it.
So I think we should perhaps consider the second question under the discussion questions here. It has come up a little bit, the topic of how this information, this assessment might help localities who are trying to apply, or planning district commissions or other organizations who are trying to apply for grant funding. Aside from what has already been discussed, are there other opportunities that come out of that context for how to better produce something that's useful? Or is that a goal that we want to pursue?
Doesn't sound like it's a goal.
Well, I mean, what's been said, I think it's been so helpful, just that getting the data to a decision maker's desk. Huge. But I don't know if that's outside of the capacity of what's possible.
Well, I just want to say, as far as capacity and what's possible, it's all right to put together kind of a wish list of what we would like to see. We know we won't be able to do everything, and there may not be the necessary inputs, but we do want to try to document what those needs are as far as information, so we can work towards something and reevaluate it and see that. So nothing's necessarily off the table. Like, do we have a private versus public land ownership and those impacts? So there's a lot of discussion about where you can and can't do projects, what does the state own and not. Is that a need that we want to try to document? Is it desired output of impacts to private land versus public land, public structures? Just trying to, are there certain questions that, and I guess maybe, is there the individual's decision? So how much water around their structure, and then trying to provide them with some guidance on how they could make a decision, as well as for localities and their planning decisions. Anything at the PDC that information you can help provide, that you have it trying to answer a question, but you're struggling. Is there something that can help?
I apologize if I wasn't there. I was talking specifically about grants.
Oh, well, so right now, like, there's grants to build capacity. So like, I want money to write a report, right? So that kind of grant application, sometimes you do just need stats, right? To try to say this is important.
And we have not. Not that we've ever focused on this, but I don't know if you had a tool where you could draw, you know, an area. A polygon and say, okay, tell me, you know, the stats, how many critical, what's the critical infrastructure, what's the value, things like that. I have a little, so that maybe would be helpful. I don't really know. But by the time you get to a grant application to build something, I feel like you probably should have already done all of your homework, like for BCA and all that. So I don't know that you can have a tool at this scale that is helpful. I'm sure that's why I'm struggling.
And I think we should think about also grant applications for like restoration type projects, natural infrastructure projects too. Those I think are a little bit different. I'm not an expert in that. But there's the physical infrastructure projects, there's capacity building, and then there's other types like restoration type grants, potentially other types of grants also.
We can make this tool spit out BCAs when you slap a project on, that would be. Yeah. But I know that's like.
That's totally with
That's what,
Especially for natural, or, you know.
I know, fund the grant writer.
Well, I do think, Chris, you brought up, what VDOT's doing. I would have to imagine that any of the state agencies that own and maintain assets would benefit from the same kind of analysis. They don't have to get the river going. Their facilities may or may not be impacted by different levels. I mean, I would think that for states, coastal resilience master plan, having a consistent set of scenarios and metrics and analysis type products to inform how each of the state agencies is thinking about how do they exist, how do they move forward, how do they protect or move or whatever, that they're all talking to each other and using some of the same inputs for their decision making. I have a question. In the new government, it would seem to me that one of the logical inputs for the agencies would be business impact that they have to put, right? That's any of that information that collected as content.
Business impact. I mean, we did look at some at, business was one of the. We looked at commercial buildings alongside public buildings in the phase 1 impact assessment. I don't know if you want to be very folks if there's anything else to add in terms of that.
All of our impacts are direct impacts. We don't have any of the indirect economic impact analysis.
Would that be something that might be useful being collected from some of the agencies? What are their critical operations? Critical infrastructure, for example. What are impediments to operation should a certain event happen? Those sorts of things, flooding being one of them. And if that, I'm just throwing this out there, if that information already exists at an agency level, and they're doing those once a year, then there may be some information in there that
information is power. I think so. Coming from outside of the state, I think that outside of the state government, sounds like that would make sense. I think from our limited perspective, I would be pleasantly surprised if they already have that information for their operation. That they have sufficiently good data and models to really be able to accurately check out what those impacts might be. I do think they probably have them individually in this, just like everybody's out there. Everyone stores their information different, or some might have it in the system, some might have it on the spreadsheet. How do we collectively, through collaboration, capture that? That can be done. It's just what's the focused initiative to be able to capture that information. Probably involves a bunch of one-on-one conversations with out, but that's a good start to get some information. Build a dashboard, something to look at, something to foster conversation, thought. Yeah, it'd be interesting again if one of the agencies can talk about this impact. So this is the, I understand correctly, this is, you look at your work in your agency and look at what could happen, what could go wrong, incorporate into that, and then whether or not sea level rise is something that's been looked at to see how more frequent flooding might be. Because I think that's one thing where this plan can provide, you know, it can be a significant benefit. It's not just to look at what our risk is right now, but help us forecast what our risk is going to be. Important, we're making capital decisions, right? We don't want to be using data that's just out today. We want to be able to think about what our conditions are going to be like for the operating conditions for that entire design line, whatever that capital decision might be. And that's something we struggle with that. I'm thinking about, you know, we don't really actually build anything, so we're fine. But, but I think, you know, if you're going to be making decisions about, well, like, so for example, if, you know, DWR and ECR, they're building at, you know, a park or a new facility out of park. You don't want them just thinking about, is it in the FEMA floodplain?
Technically, they have to follow you.
Right, but I think there's a difference between,
I agree. I'm sorry.
you know, I think turning that into a benefit cost, you know, turning those policies into some way to actually incorporate benefit cost assessment for how and whether and when and where you might build that project. That I think is something that we don't have right now.
That's what VDOT is doing, and it's taking. And how much money?
I don't know.
Yeah, sure, I bet. But y'all are the only agency that's scale, right? Are there other agencies
Yeah, future impact.
that huge assessment that's going as detailed as what that is?
TWR,
Yeah,
they
yeah.
have some other resources within public access.
Oh, they are? And
And don't forget, not to throw another, we have to do the Virginia statewide flood protection master plan. That's gonna be going on at the same time and then beyond. So that's really kind of 2024 and 2025.
The focus is.
And that's focused on state scale, state agencies too, and all flooding across the Commonwealth.
Maybe to that point, the question, if I'm following along correctly, I don't know if we are gonna be ready to, you know, have our analysis feed into this and kind of be the transportation sector assessment. But I also don't know if we want it to be. I mean, if we kind of create, it would have every sector, we want this to have every sector and analyzed the same way. And then when our analysis is ready, there's like an acknowledgement here that says, but you not have a more granular transportation analysis. And that was what I was kind of alluding to at the very beginning of how does our analysis feed into this vice versa, or do they come together at all? Maybe it's this analysis is what it is, and then our analysis is somewhat published and acknowledged by. That's what we're trying to figure out.
I want to acknowledge that we have just 2 minutes remaining before we need to go to public comment.
Well, I would say that in terms of I thought one of the questions was more like economic impact of operations. I'm not sure that the public piece of these things is actually where a lot of economic development, or sorry, economic impact is. It may be on the private side, and it certainly gets raised when we talk to in our committees, but we are way behind on figuring that out. And the big thing is like the disruption in business, like, okay, what's it cost you if you can't drive, deliver stuff, whatever, not just like your building got damaged, but that's ongoing. So I think that's an interesting gap. So it's a gap. I don't know where we should go next, but I guess I'm more interested in the private part than the public part of that.
It feels as if we can capture all that information, then however way you all decide to sort of slice and dice and highlight indicators, you know, it can be sort of that focus for that period of time.
Yeah, I kind of raised that as just an example of it's already existing work problem that's already out there. That if there is any information in it that could be useful in this discussion, even as a sample or anecdotal, check in to see what we're doing on a multiple basis. Or business impact analysis, or what they're gauging, that sort of thing. I'll try and bring that information today.
Great. Do we have any members online? Oh, okay.
No one has indicated they would like to speak online.
Yeah. Okay, well, we can, in that case, continue discussion until 12 or conclude with action items and scheduling. I'll defer to the chair.
Yeah, okay, we'll sort of summarize some of the takeaways, action items. I'm sure we've got, read anything we did, let us know.
Well, we're having taking notes.
Yeah. And then, everyone good with that? First is identifying the goals and the metrics, focusing on how, obviously, how we can prioritize. Yeah, we're gonna come up with a way to add localities. Find out who else wants to participate. Like 3 overall action. We can summarize that in notes for this week notes. If there are any other takeaways, feel free to add. We'll put that out as draft. That can be reviewed in the next meeting.
If you could send those to me, we'll make sure we put them in the official meeting notes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So with that, does anyone have anything else? They'd like to use the last few minutes?
But if we have ideas for either advisors or presenters, that those to share and Carolyn. Okay. And not to each other, because
Exactly. Yes, please keep that in mind.
Is this, did you all, the chairs, get what you thought you wanted to out of this conversation? Because I think it's hard to have these conversations and feel like we're all on the same page and accomplishing what, we might think this intended committee is supposed to do versus what you might. So it would be good to get feedback as to how we did in terms of expectations.
From my perspective, I'm learning as we go along. I'm certainly not a subject that I'm not an expert in this. And so, I just want my participation from it is at depth, the experts like yourself. So I might connect to play that part on TV. But I think I've learned a lot.
Yeah, I think we had some very good discussions, some good questions were brought up. The major things we were hoping to get out of the meeting were confirmation that the subcommittee roles and objectives were consistent with what the role that you all expected to be playing, which I think we did arrive at a good discussion around that and agreed that that is what we're doing here, with some amendments. And then to get some feedback on the outputs, what this risk assessment looks like. I think we have some good feedback to put into writing and to create something a little bit more detailed for our next meeting when we're planning to continue to talk about that, so we can bring it back to the subcommittee for further kind of decision and then transition to talk about inputs. So short answer, yes, I think we did get what we were hoping to out of the meeting. And it's also the first time you all are meeting, so we covered a lot.
It'll get better, and I'm sure we'll get more strategic in those, future meetings as well.
Anyone have anything else? If not, I will make a motion to adjourn. 1 second.
Can I say quickly, we're gonna send out a survey. We're gonna try to identify a recurring day and time to meet, so we're not scheduling these one-off all the time. So please be on the lookout for that. before the next meeting.
And meeting minutes will come from,
Well, from us to them.
okay, got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
Great.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.